He walked into the room and immediately deferred to everyone else. He downplayed his own achievements. He let a junior colleague take credit for an idea that was actually his. Everyone in that room walked away thinking the exact same thing. What a humble, down-to-earth person. That was the entire plan. Because real humility and performed humility look almost identical from the outside. And the people who understand that difference hold a kind of power most of us never even notice operating on us. Today, we're breaking down one of the most underestimated tools in the psychology of influence, the calculated use of humility by high-status individuals. Not the genuine kind, the strategic kind, and by the end of this video, you'll start noticing it in rooms you're standing in right now. This video explores psychological concepts and social dynamics for educational and informational purposes. Understanding these patterns is about awareness, not a manual for manipulating the people around you. Let's start with a question that sounds simple, but almost no one actually thinks through. Why would someone with genuine power ever choose to appear humble? On the surface, it seems counterproductive. If you have status, authority, wealth, expertise, the intuitive move is to display it. Peacocks display their feathers. CEOs display their titles. Powerful people, you'd assume, display their power. But here's what centuries of observed social behavior and decades of modern psychological research both point to. Displayed power very often triggers resistance. It activates something almost primal in the people around it, a defensive instinct, a competitive instinct, a desire to challenge or diminish whoever is doing the displaying. Humility, on the other hand, disarms that exact instinct. When someone with obvious status behaves as though they don't need you to acknowledge that status, something strange happens in the room. People lower their guard, they stop competing, and, this is the critical part, they start extending trust far more quickly than they would to someone who demanded it outright. High-status individuals who understand this consciously, or even semi-consciously, have discovered something extremely valuable. Humility isn't the opposite of power. Used correctly, it's a more efficient delivery mechanism for power than dominance ever was. Let's make this concrete with a pattern you've almost certainly witnessed, even if you never named it. A senior executive walks into a meeting. Instead of taking the head of the table, they sit along the side. Instead of speaking first, they ask a junior employee's opinion before offering their own. When a good idea gets proposed, they say, "Great thinking," rather than presenting it as their own conclusion, even when they'd already reached the same conclusion privately days earlier. To everyone in that room, this executive reads as approachable, secure, not needing to prove anything. And they're right, that is what it signals. What most people in the room don't consciously register is that this behavior is also, simultaneously, an extremely effective status move, because true confidence, real security in one's position, is one of the most reliable social signals of high status that exists. The person who doesn't need to grab the head of the table is implicitly communicating that their position is so secure it doesn't require the symbol. Ironically, the performance of not needing status often communicates more status than actively claiming it would. This is the mechanism. Now let's talk about why it works so consistently across different contexts: politics, business, relationships, even parenting, because the underlying psychology is the same everywhere. Human beings are, at a fundamental level, extremely sensitive to hierarchy. We are constantly, often unconsciously, scanning the people around us for status cues, tone of voice, posture, word choice, who defers to whom. This isn't a character flaw, it's deeply wired social cognition that helped our ancestors navigate group survival for tens of thousands of years, long before boardrooms or dinner parties existed. Because we're this sensitive to hierarchy, we're also extremely sensitive to violations of expected hierarchy, and violations in the humble direction register very differently in our minds than violations in the dominant direction. When someone acts more dominant than their actual status would suggest, think of a mid-level employee talking over their manager, we register that as a threat, an overreach, something requiring correction or resistance. But when someone acts more humble than their actual status would suggest, a CEO doing the dishes at the company retreat, a celebrity waiting in a normal line, a wealthy person driving an unremarkable car, we don't register that as a threat at all. We register it as a gift, as generosity, as a form of respect being extended to us specifically, the observer, because they didn't have to behave that way, and they chose to anyway. This asymmetry is the entire foundation of strategic humility as a power tool. Displaying more status than you have creates resistance. Displaying less status than you have creates goodwill, often disproportionate goodwill, far beyond what the actual gesture would seem to warrant. Now, here's where this gets genuinely important to understand, because there's a critical distinction we need to draw clearly: the difference between humility as a value and humility as a strategy. Genuine humility, the kind most philosophical and religious traditions actually teach, comes from an accurate internal assessment of oneself, recognizing your limitations, treating others as fundamentally equal in worth, regardless of status differences, and not needing external validation to feel secure. It's an internal orientation. It doesn't particularly care whether anyone is watching. Strategic humility, the kind we're examining today, is a performance calibrated for an audience. It's deployed selectively, often intensely visible in public, professional settings, and notably absent behind closed doors, in private interactions where there's nothing to gain from the display. This is actually one of the most reliable ways to distinguish the two in real life. Genuine humility tends to be remarkably consistent regardless of who's watching. Strategic humility tends to fluctuate dramatically based on audience size, audience importance, and whether the moment is being observed or recorded. Historical figures across centuries have understood and explicitly written about this distinction, usually without using our modern psychological vocabulary, but describing the exact same mechanism. 16th century political philosophy, particularly writing that emerged from observing Renaissance Italian courts, described this pattern in unusually blunt terms. Rulers who wanted to secure loyalty needed to appear virtuous, and appearing virtuous was, in practical terms, often more valuable than actually being virtuous, because the public could only ever judge appearances, never the true internal state of the person ruling them. This wasn't cynicism for its own sake. It was an observation about how human social judgment actually functions, stripped of the comfortable assumption that people generally see through performance to the truth beneath it. Most people, most of the time, don't. They respond to the signal, not the substance behind it, and this remains just as true in a modern office as it was in a 15th century royal court. So how does this actually play out, mechanically, in modern high-status behavior? Let's walk through the specific tactics, because once you see the pattern named explicitly, you'll start recognizing it everywhere. The first tactic is what we might call credit deflection. A high-status individual, when praised for a success, deflects that praise onto their team, their mentors, or circumstances beyond their control. "I couldn't have done it without this team" is the most common version of this phrase in the English language, appearing in nearly every acceptance speech, every executive interview, every award ceremony. Sometimes, this deflection is completely genuine. Teams genuinely do contribute, and acknowledging that is simply accurate and fair. But strategically deployed, credit deflection accomplishes something additional beyond fairness. It makes the deflector appear secure enough not to need the credit, which, as we discussed, is itself read as a high-status signal. The person doesn't lose status by deflecting credit. In many cases, they gain more status than they would have by simply accepting it outright. The second tactic is selective self-deprecation, making minor, carefully chosen jokes at your own expense, particularly about things that don't actually threaten your core competence or authority. A brilliant surgeon joking about being hopeless at parallel parking, a powerful CEO joking about forgetting people's names. These self-deprecating admissions are calculated precisely because they're harmless. They cost the speaker nothing in terms of actual perceived competence, while generating substantial warmth and relatability in return, an extremely favorable exchange rate when you examine it closely. Notice what's conspicuously absent from these jokes: self-deprecation about anything that would genuinely threaten how the audience perceives their core competence. You'll rarely hear a surgeon joke about being bad at surgery or a CEO joke about being bad at making decisions. The self-deprecation is surgically confined to irrelevant domains, which is precisely what makes it safe to deploy as a status tool rather than a genuine vulnerability. The third tactic is what researchers sometimes call strategic incompetence or calculated deference, visibly asking others for input or help on matters the high-status individual could very plausibly handle alone, specifically to signal collaborative, non-threatening leadership. "What do you all think?" asked by someone who has already privately decided the answer isn't necessarily dishonest, but it is, functionally, a status performance dressed up as genuine open inquiry. The fourth tactic, and one of the most subtle, is physical humility, postural and spatial choices that signal low dominance despite high actual status. Sitting rather than standing when others are seated. Removing a suit jacket to appear more casual and approachable. Choosing modest transportation or clothing despite having the resources for something far more visibly expensive. Body language researchers have documented this pattern extensively. It's remarkably consistent across cultures and industries, appearing among politicians, executives, celebrities, and religious leaders alike. Now here's the question this naturally raises, and it's the one that actually matters most practically. How do you tell genuine humility apart from strategic humility in real time when you're standing in the room with someone? There isn't a single infallible tell. People who are genuinely skilled at this can be extremely difficult to read, even for trained observers. But there are a handful of patterns worth watching for. Watch for consistency across contexts. Does this person behave with the same apparent humility when there's no audience, no career benefit, no social reward available? Genuine humility tends to persist in low-stakes, unwitnessed moments. Strategic humility tends to evaporate the instant it stops being useful, noticeably harsher, more demanding, more status-conscious, with subordinates, service staff, or anyone who can't meaningfully advance their position. Watch for what happens when the humility is actually tested, when someone directly challenges or disagrees with the humble person in a real, substantive way, not just performatively deferring to them. Genuinely humble people can generally absorb genuine disagreement without their composure cracking, because their sense of security was never actually dependent on maintaining the humble image in the first place. Strategically humble people often reveal something sharper and more defensive underneath, once the performance stops serving its purpose and an actual threat to status appears. And watch for proportion. Genuine humility tends to be quiet. It doesn't need an audience to register it, doesn't require repeated retelling, doesn't require the story of the humble moment to circulate afterward. Strategic humility often has a curious tendency to become a story people tell about you, one that seems to circulate suspiciously well, almost as though it was constructed with retelling already in mind. Here's what makes this entire topic genuinely uncomfortable to sit with and worth being honest about. None of this makes strategic humility purely manipulative or purely cynical in every single case. Many people who use these tactics aren't cold calculators running social chess moves. They've simply learned, often unconsciously through years of social feedback, which behaviors generate positive responses and which generate resistance, and they've adjusted their default behavior accordingly, the same way anyone adjusts behavior based on what consistently doesn't. The line between learned effective social behavior and calculated manipulation is genuinely blurry, and it's worth resisting the urge to sort every humble, high-status person you encounter into one clean box or the other. But understanding the mechanism itself remains valuable regardless of any individual's specific intent, for one simple, practical reason. Once you understand how this works, you become considerably harder to manipulate by people who are using it cynically and deliberately, while simultaneously becoming better equipped to recognize and appropriately value genuine humility when you actually encounter it, rather than reflexively trusting every humble gesture at face value without examining it further. Because here's the uncomfortable truth about all of this. Humility, real or performed, is one of the most disarming social signals that exists. It lowers your guard faster than almost anything else in the entire toolkit of social influence. That's exactly why it works so consistently and so reliably. And it's exactly why it's worth understanding the mechanism behind it. Not so you can weaponize it yourself, but so you're not walking through every room in your life completely unaware of when it's already being weaponized on you by people who understood this dynamic long before you did. So the next time someone with obvious status deflects a compliment, cracks a self-deprecating joke, or asks for your opinion they may have already privately decided on, pay attention, not with cynicism toward every humble person you meet, because plenty of humility genuinely is exactly what it appears to be, but with awareness, because now you know what to actually watch for. If breaking down the hidden psychology behind power, influence, and human behavior is something you want more of, subscribe, because every week, Shadowplicit uncovers another pattern operating on you that you've probably never consciously registered before. Have you ever caught someone using this tactic in real life, or caught yourself doing it? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every one.